Ethan Cole gripped his daughter's hand as they rushed through the terminal. Their boarding passes crumpled and damp from the sprint through security. Gate 47 was already closing when they arrived. Breathless and apologetic, the gate agent scanned their passes with a tight smile and waved them through without a word. They were the last passengers to board. Lily pressed close to her father's side as they walked down the jetway, her small fingers wrapped tightly around his. The flight attendant at the aircraft door directed them to the very back of the plane. Row 38, the final row before the rear galley. Ethan lifted Lily into the window seat and settled beside her, exhaling slowly. Across the aisle, a woman in a charcoal blazer glanced back at them briefly, her gaze sharp and assessing before returning to the tablet in her lap. Victoria Hale had boarded this flight under her maiden name, dressed in understated business casual rather than the designer suits she typically wore in boardrooms. As CEO of Hale Aerospace Industries, she had spent the past 18 months overseeing development of the company's newest commercial aircraft, the HA-9 series, a project representing billions in investment. Today's flight was an unofficial evaluation completely off the books. She wanted to experience the plane as an ordinary passenger would, to observe its performance under real conditions without filtered reports from engineers protecting their budgets. Her tablet displayed cabin pressure readings, vibration metrics, and fuel consumption data streaming in real time from the aircraft systems. She had access that no ordinary passenger would ever possess, and she intended to use every minute of this flight to scrutinize what her company had built. In the back row, Ethan's eyes moved without conscious thought across the overhead panels, the emergency exit placards, the subtle curvature of the cabin walls. He noticed the way the air vents directed flow, the rhythm of the pressurization system cycling through its startup sequence, the almost imperceptible vibration that meant the auxiliary power unit was still running. These observations came to him as naturally as breathing, remnants of a life he had tried very hard to leave behind. Lily tugged at his sleeve and pointed out the window at the baggage handlers, loading the final cargo containers into the belly of the aircraft. Her voice was soft when she asked if the plane was strong enough to carry all those heavy bags plus all the passengers. Ethan smiled at her innocent question and told her that planes were built to carry much more than they usually did, that engineers spent years making sure every single part could handle whatever the sky threw at them. He did not tell her that he used to be one of those people. The aircraft began its pushback from the gate, and the flight attendants moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency. Ethan watched them work, noting the way one attendant fumbled slightly with an overhead bin latch near row 20. She pressed the release mechanism twice before it finally clicked open. When the same attendant passed by their row, he caught her attention with a quiet word. He suggested that the secondary latch sometimes stuck on newer aircraft if the cabin temperature dropped too quickly during boarding, and that a firm press on the lower corner usually released the tension. The attendant blinked at him with surprise, then him with a curious smile before continuing. Victoria had been reviewing fuel consumption projections when she heard the exchange. She lowered her device and observed the man more carefully. He was perhaps mid-30s with the kind of weathered calm that came from experience rather than age. His daughter sat beside him, a girl of maybe 7 or 8 with her father's same serious eyes. There was something in the way the man held himself, an awareness of his surroundings that seemed almost tactical. Victoria had seen that particular posture before in test pilots and senior flight engineers, people who had spent so many hours in aircraft that they became extensions of the machines themselves. She made a mental note and returned to her data, though part of her attention remained fixed on him. The plane taxied slowly toward the runway, and Lily pressed her face eagerly to the small window to watch the terminal buildings shrink behind them. She asked her father whether flying was actually dangerous, or whether the movies she had seen were exaggerating. Ethan considered the question carefully before answering. He told her that flying was genuinely one of the safest ways to travel, that thousands of flights took off and landed safely every single day. He told her that the people who designed and built and flew these planes took their responsibility seriously. He did not tell her about the nights he still woke in cold sweat with his hands gripping phantom controls. He did not tell her about the career that had ended, not with a crash, but with a bureaucratic silence that felt just as devastating. Victoria noticed the girl's question and the father's measured response. She could not hear his exact words, but she could see the patient way he held his daughter's hand, the gentleness in his expression. There was a tenderness that contrasted sharply with the professional alertness she had observed earlier. She wondered what circumstances had brought a single father and his young daughter to the very last seats on a cross-country flight. The engines roared to full power as the aircraft accelerated down the runway, pressing all passengers back into their seats. Victoria felt the thrill she always experienced at that moment, but today her attention kept drifting back to the quiet man in row 38. The aircraft climbed steadily through scattered clouds as Lily watched the ground fall away beneath them. She had flown only twice before in her young life, and both times her father had held her hand through the entire journey. Her father seemed completely at ease with the whole experience, his breathing slow and steady, his gaze occasionally sweeping across the cabin. When the seatbelt sign finally dimmed, Ethan leaned over to point out landmarks visible through the window. He named mountain ranges and rivers with casual precision, explaining how pilots in earlier decades had used such visual references for navigation before GPS became standard. Lily listened with the focused attention of a child who trusted her father completely. In the forward section of economy class, Victoria pulled up a personnel database on her tablet through a secure connection. She was not technically supposed to access employee records from unsecured devices, but she had helped build the security protocols herself and knew how to work around them. Something about the man nagged at her consciousness. She began a systematic search through archived incident reports, filtering for cases involving pilots who had left the company under unusual circumstances. The HA-9, currently carrying them through the sky, had been in development for 3 years, but its predecessor model, the HA-7, had a more complicated history. There had been issues during the testing phase, concerns raised by the flight evaluation team. Most had been properly addressed, but a few had been quietly shelved when they threatened to delay the production timeline. The aircraft entered a patch of turbulence without warning, the kind that made overhead bins rattle and nervous passengers grip their armrests. Ethan's hand moved instinctively to steady Lily, but most of his attention was elsewhere. He was listening carefully to the vibration frequency traveling through the airframe, feeling the way the fuselage absorbed and distributed the stress. This was not ordinary turbulence. The oscillation pattern suggested the aircraft had entered a complex weather system where multiple air currents were intersecting at different speeds and temperatures. He had flown through exactly this kind of situation dozens of times during his career, and he knew that the standard response was to climb or descend to find smoother air. But this plane was maintaining its current altitude, and the shaking was continuing far longer than it should have. In the cockpit, Captain Marcus Webb frowned at his instruments as the turbulence continued. His first officer, a younger man named Torres, had gone pale and was gripping his console. Torres had mentioned feeling unwell before departure, but he had insisted he was fit to fly. Now, 32,000 feet above Nebraska, it was becoming clear that his condition was more serious than nerves. His hands trembled as he reached for the radio, and his voice cracked when he tried to speak. Webb realized his co-pilot was experiencing something requiring medical attention. He needed to handle this turbulence while also monitoring Torres, a dangerous division of attention that no pilot wanted. Webb suddenly remembered reviewing the passenger manifest before departure. There had been a name that caught his attention, a former pilot who had been marked in the database for reasons not fully explained. He made a quick decision that went against standard protocol, but followed a deeper instinct. He keyed the intercom and asked the flight attendants to check whether there was anyone on board with aviation training. The announcement crackled through the speakers, carefully worded to avoid alarming passengers. Ethan heard the unusual request and felt something cold settle in his chest. He had spent 5 years actively trying to distance himself from the cockpit, from the world that had chewed him up without any real explanation, but the training he had accumulated over 15 years never really left a person. He looked down at Lily, who was watching him with wide eyes, and made a difficult decision. He carefully unbuckled his seatbelt, told his daughter firmly to stay in her seat, and walked toward the front of the cabin. A flight attendant met him near the forward galley. He introduced himself quietly as a former commercial pilot with more than 15 years of experience. The attendant led him toward the cockpit door. Victoria watched the man rise and move forward with a purposeful, confident stride that confirmed her earlier suspicions. She noted how the flight attendants responded to his presence, the immediate shift in their body language from anxious to hopeful. When he disappeared through the cockpit door, she felt an unexpected chill. She pulled up the incident database again, searching with new parameters. She expanded her search to include records marked as confidential cases requiring executive-level clearance. A name appeared attached to a personnel file sealed 7 years earlier. Ethan Cole, former senior evaluation pilot for Hale Aerospace Industries employment, terminated following an internal review. The file contained no further details, only a notation that all related documentation had been archived under restricted access. Inside the cockpit, Ethan quickly assessed the situation. Torres was semi-conscious, pulse weak but steady, clearly unable to perform his duties. Captain Webb had his hands full, managing the aircraft through continued turbulence. Ethan did not reach for the controls. He knew the legal and professional boundaries better than anyone, but he could observe the instruments, offer experienced advice, and provide calm support. He studied the instrument readings and immediately recognized the specific weather pattern. This was a complex atmospheric convergence zone, exactly the kind of challenging condition he had spent months analyzing during his years at Hale Aerospace. He told Captain Webb in a calm voice that climbing to a higher altitude would actually make things worse because the instability extended above their current flight level. He suggested instead a gradual descent to around 26,000 feet, combined with a slight course adjustment toward the south, where weather radar showed clearer conditions. Webb hesitated for only a moment before implementing the recommendations. The turbulence began to ease almost immediately as they descended. Torres was breathing more steadily now, and Webb's grip on the controls relaxed. Ethan remained standing calmly in the cockpit doorway, continuing to provide quiet observations as the aircraft found smoother air. Victoria sat frozen in her seat, staring at her tablet. The technical terminology she could hear through the partially open cockpit door matched phrases from internal company documents, specifications that only someone with deep knowledge of Hale aircraft systems would know. Ethan Cole had not simply been an ordinary pilot. He had been an integral part of the team that evaluated prototype systems, a trusted expert whose professional opinions had directly shaped engineering decisions. And then he had simply vanished from the company roster, his file sealed, his contributions erased from all official records. She began to understand that whatever had happened 7 years ago was far more complicated than a simple termination. Someone with significant authority had worked very deliberately to make sure that Ethan Cole's voice was never heard again. The aircraft leveled off smoothly at its new altitude, and the cabin gradually returned to calm. Ethan spoke briefly with Captain Webb at the cockpit door, receiving the weary but genuine gratitude of a fellow professional. Torres was recovering slowly, but would require medical attention. After landing, Ethan turned and made his way back through the cabin, moving with quiet efficiency. Other passengers glanced at him curiously as he passed, sensing something significant had occurred. Lily reached immediately for his hand the moment he settled back into his seat, her small fingers gripping tightly. She asked in a small voice if everything was okay now. He told her gently that the pilots had just needed a little help, that everything was fine. Victoria watched him settle back into his seat, her tablet momentarily forgotten. She had spent years climbing the corporate ladder at Hale Aerospace, navigating the politics and compromises that came with running a major industrial company. She had made many difficult decisions, had balanced competing priorities, and had occasionally looked the other way when inconvenient truths threatened to derail important projects. But she had never considered herself someone who would knowingly sacrifice an individual's career to protect a production timeline. Now, looking at the quiet man comforting his daughter in the back row, she wondered if that was exactly what her company had done. She wondered if she had unknowingly inherited a moral debt. Lily eventually fell asleep against her father's shoulder as the flight continued westward. Ethan stared out the window at the clouds below, his mind traveling through memories he had tried to bury. 7 years ago, he had been at the absolute peak of his career, a highly respected evaluation pilot whose assessments carried real weight in design meetings. He had identified a potential issue with the HA-7's control surface response under certain specific weather conditions, a subtle flaw that might never manifest during normal operations, but could become genuinely dangerous in extreme circumstances. He had documented his concerns thoroughly, submitted formal reports through proper channels, and waited patiently for the engineering team to address the problem. Instead of taking his concerns seriously, he had been called into a meeting with executives who explained with polite firmness that the production timeline could not accommodate additional testing delays. The HA-7 was already behind schedule, and customers were growing impatient. His reports were filed and promptly forgotten, and he was reassigned to less critical projects. When he pushed back formally, requesting that his findings be reviewed by an independent safety board, the polite meetings stopped. Within 6 months, his employment had been terminated for undisclosed reasons, his professional certifications suspended, pending a review that never occurred, and his name removed from all company documentation. He had become a ghost, erased from the industry he had devoted his life to serving. Victoria rose from her seat and walked toward the back of the cabin, her decision made before she fully understood what she was doing. She stopped in the narrow aisle beside row 38 and looked down at the man who had just helped save the lives of everyone aboard her company's aircraft. His daughter was sleeping peacefully, her small head resting against her father's arm. Ethan looked up at Victoria with eyes that held no surprise, only a kind of weary recognition. He had noticed her, watching him throughout the flight. He did not know exactly who she was, but he clearly knew she was not simply an ordinary passenger. Victoria introduced herself quietly, using only her first name. She said she could not help noticing his expertise during the turbulence incident and asked directly whether he had any professional aviation experience. Ethan considered the question before answering. He said that he used to fly professionally, that it was a long time ago now. Victoria pressed gently, asking what had made him stop. Before he could respond, Lily stirred restlessly in her sleep and knocked her small backpack off the seat onto the floor. It slid forward, coming to rest against Victoria's shoes. She bent to pick it up and handed it back to Ethan, their fingers brushing briefly. The contact seemed to break something open between them. Ethan thanked her for retrieving the backpack and gently settled Lily more comfortably against the window. When he looked back at Victoria, his expression had shifted, becoming more guarded. He asked her what she did for a living. Victoria hesitated, then told him she worked in aerospace manufacturing, that she was traveling to evaluate a project. It was not a lie, but it was far from the whole truth. Ethan nodded slowly. He observed that aerospace was a complicated industry, that the people who worked in it carried very heavy responsibilities. Victoria agreed, adding quietly that sometimes those responsibilities turned out heavier than anyone outside the industry could understand. She returned to her seat with Ethan's words echoing in her mind. She pulled up the sealed personnel file again, digging much deeper into the archived documentation. What she found made her stomach turn. Ethan Cole had not simply raised vague concerns about the HA-7 aircraft. He had specifically identified a particular failure mode that could occur when the aircraft encountered complex atmospheric conditions, exactly the kind of challenging weather they had just navigated through. His technical analysis had been detailed and thorough, his methodology rigorous, his conclusions unambiguous, and all of it had been deliberately ignored by executives who no longer worked at the company. Those decision-makers were mostly retired now, their names scattered across country club rosters. The engineers who had supported his findings had been quietly reassigned. The underlying problem had eventually been partially addressed in later production runs, but the original fleet still carried the fundamental flaw. Victoria realized she had been holding her breath and forced herself to exhale. She was the CEO now, which meant everything related to this situation was her responsibility. Every H-7 aircraft still flying anywhere in the world was her personal liability, her moral burden, and the man who had tried to prevent this, who had lost everything for speaking the truth, was sitting 20 feet behind her, holding his sleeping daughter. Victoria had spent her career believing corporations could be ethical while remaining profitable, that good leadership meant making hard choices while staying true to values. Now she wondered whether those beliefs had been naive or worse. Convenient lies, she told herself. The flight continued through increasingly clear skies, but the emotional atmosphere had changed for Victoria. She found herself glancing back toward row 38 every few minutes, each look adding weight to the decision forming in her mind. The pattern she was seeing was troublingly clear. Her company had silenced a whistleblower to protect its bottom line, and that silence had potentially endangered thousands of passengers over 7 years. The fact that no major incident had occurred was nothing more than luck. Luck was not a safety system. Luck was not something you could ethically rely on when lives were at stake. Lily woke as the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their descent into Seattle. She rubbed her eyes and asked if they were almost there. Ethan smiled and said they would be on the ground in about 40 minutes, that she had slept through most of the flight. She smiled back and pressed her face to the window, watching as the landscape rose to meet them through the thinning clouds. Ethan watched her with an expression of pure tenderness, the kind of deep love that required no words. Whatever had happened in his past, whatever had been taken from him, he had clearly built something precious and meaningful in the years since. Victoria knew she should probably wait, should take time to process everything before acting. But watching that little girl so innocent and trusting made waiting feel like moral cowardice. She typed rapidly on her tablet, composing an urgent message to her chief technology officer, requesting an immediate comprehensive audit of all HA-7 aircraft still in service. She flagged it with the highest priority and added a note that she would explain upon landing. Then she rose and walked back toward row 38. This time, she did not introduce herself as a casual traveler. She crouched in the aisle beside Ethan's seat and told him quietly but clearly that she was Victoria Hale, the current CEO of Hale Aerospace Industries. She told him she had accessed his sealed personnel file during the flight and had read his original technical reports. She told him she now understood, at least partially, what had been done to him. Ethan's expression did not visibly change, but something flickered in his eyes. A spark of anger he had buried so deeply he had almost forgotten it existed. Victoria continued speaking in a low voice. She said she could not undo what had been done 7 years ago, but she could acknowledge it now publicly if necessary. She could make sure his safety concerns were finally addressed properly. She could work to restore his certifications and reputation if that was what he wanted. Ethan listened without interrupting, his hand resting protectively on Lily's shoulder. When Victoria finished, he remained silent for a long moment. Then he asked why she was telling him this, what she expected to gain from making such a confession. Victoria admitted honestly that she did not know what she expected. She only knew that remaining silent was no longer an acceptable option, not after what she had witnessed and learned. The old way of handling inconvenient truths, burying them and hoping they never surfaced, was not something she could participate in now. Lily looked up at the woman, talking to her father with unself-conscious curiosity. She asked Victoria directly whether she was one of the people who built airplanes, her voice bright with wonder. Victoria found herself smiling despite the gravity of the situation and said yes, she did help build airplanes. Lily announced that was very cool and immediately asked whether the airplanes were actually safe. The question hung in the air like a judgment, and Victoria felt its weight settle on her shoulders. She told Lily carefully that she was working very hard to make sure the airplanes were as safe as possible. Lily seemed satisfied and returned her attention to the window. Ethan watched his daughter accept Victoria's words with simple trust, and something tightly wound in his chest loosened slightly. He had spent so long protecting Lily from the bitterness that had threatened to consume him. So many years building a life that did not depend on the industry that had betrayed him. He had worked a series of odd jobs after losing his certifications, struggling to find footing in a world that suddenly had no place for his expertise. Eventually, he had found steady employment as a maintenance supervisor at a small regional airport. Honest work that let him stay connected to aviation without being consumed by it. He had made a kind of peace with his new life, or at least tried to. Now, Victoria's words were threatening to reopen wounds he had spent years stitching closed. The aircraft encountered minor turbulence as it descended through the cloud layer, and Ethan's attention immediately shifted to analyzing vibration patterns. His expert ear caught something concerning, a slight asymmetry in how the aircraft structure was responding to stress. It was subtle enough that most passengers would never notice, but to someone who had spent years evaluating aircraft performance, it registered as a red flag. He mentioned the observation quietly to Victoria, describing the specific frequency pattern and what it might indicate about control surface calibration. Victoria listened intently, her tablet already open to real-time diagnostic data. The data confirmed exactly what Ethan had sensed through physical intuition. There was a minor discrepancy in the left aileron's response characteristics, a tiny delay falling just outside normal acceptable parameters. It was not dangerous on its own, but in combination with other factors, such a discrepancy could compound into something more serious. Victoria immediately contacted the flight deck through her private channel, relaying Ethan's observation and recommending a thorough maintenance inspection. After landing, Captain Webb acknowledged her advisory with professional courtesy. When Victoria closed the communication channel, Ethan asked whether she always carried that level of technical access on commercial flights. She admitted today was unusual, that she had wanted to observe the Hay 9 under normal operational conditions without the filters of formal evaluation. He nodded slowly, understanding the impulse, even while questioning the methodology. He observed that sometimes the only way to truly see the truth was to look at it from a seat in economy class, where your view was not obscured by corporate presentations and optimistic projections. The conversation that developed was careful at first, each testing the other's intentions, but it gradually became more honest. Victoria shared her vision for Hale Aerospace, her determination to build a culture that genuinely prioritized safety over production schedules, that treated engineers and pilots as valued partners rather than obstacles. Ethan listened without commentary, but his silence was not hostile. He was evaluating her words the way he had once evaluated aircraft systems, testing for weaknesses and inconsistencies. He had been burned too badly to accept promises at face value, but he could recognize genuine sincerity when he encountered it. Lily had grown bored with the adult conversation and pulled out a notebook and colored pencils. She began drawing airplanes, carefully, adding windows and wings and clouds with focused concentration. Ethan watched her for a moment, then shared something personal. He told Victoria that his daughter had once been absolutely terrified of flying, that the first time they tried to board together, she had cried so hard he nearly carried her off before they left the gate. It had taken years of patient explanation, airport visits, picture books about how aircraft worked. Before she could finally see flight as something wonderful, Victoria understood immediately that he was offering her something beyond a simple anecdote. Trust, once broken, could be rebuilt, but it required patience and honesty and a willingness to start from the beginning. But she could offer something he had not received 7 years ago: respect for his expertise and acknowledgement of his sacrifice. The aircraft touched down in Seattle with a gentle bump. Passengers began gathering belongings before the seatbelt sign dimmed, the universal impatience of travelers eager to escape confinement. Victoria stayed in her seat as the cabin emptied, eyes fixed on Ethan and Lily as they prepared to disembark. She had already sent messages to her legal team and communications director, initiating a process she knew would be complicated and painful. Revealing the truth about Ethan Cole's termination meant revealing company failures, accepting liability, inviting scrutiny. Ethan lifted Lily onto his shoulders and made his way toward the exit, pausing at the cockpit door to shake hands with Captain Webb. The captain thanked him again, and Ethan responded with the modesty of someone who had simply done what needed to be done. Victoria followed at a distance. When they reached the jetway, she caught up and asked if he had time to speak privately before leaving the airport. There were people she wanted him to meet. Ethan hesitated, hand tightening on Lily's ankle. He said he needed to get his daughter home, that she had school tomorrow. Victoria nodded and gave him her card, her direct number handwritten on the back. Saying she hoped he would call when ready, he took the card without looking at it. The terminal was crowded with travelers from multiple arriving flights, a chaos of suitcases and reunion embraces. Victoria moved toward a private lounge where her team waited, her mind cycling through challenges ahead. A press release would need drafting. The board would need briefing. The HA-7 fleet would need inspection and potentially modification, costly and logistically complex. None of it would be simple, and some might threaten her position as CEO. She found she did not care as much as she expected. In baggage claim, Ethan waited beside the carousel while Lily counted black suitcases. He still had not looked at Victoria's card. For 7 years, he had carried the weight of being the person who knew the truth, but could not speak it. He had watched Ha-7 aircraft fly overhead and wondered if this would be the day something went wrong. The fact that it had not brought him no comfort. Luck was not a safety system. His phone buzzed with a text from his neighbor confirming she had fed the cat. The ordinary details of his ordinary life felt strange after the past hours. He was still a maintenance supervisor, still a single father, still a man whose career had ended before it should have. Nothing had changed except everything. Lily spotted their suitcase and pointed excitedly. Ethan grabbed the bag and took her hand as they headed for the exit. The late afternoon sun was breaking through Seattle's cloud cover. Lily asked if they could get ice cream. Ethan smiled and said, "Maybe, depending on traffic." Victoria's team was assembled in the private lounge when she arrived, expressions ranging from curious to concerned. She had not explained the urgency of her summons. Now standing before them, she took a moment to organize her thoughts. She told them about Ethan Cole, about the sealed file and ignored warnings and turbulence encounter that had brought everything into focus. She told them the company had made a serious mistake 7 years ago and that it was time to make it right. The chief technology officer asked what specifically she was proposing. Victoria outlined a 3-part plan. First, a comprehensive safety review of all H-7 aircraft still in operation. Second, a formal acknowledgement of Ethan Cole's contributions and restoration of his professional certifications. Third, an internal investigation into the decision-making that had led to his termination with accountability for those who had prioritized deadlines over safety. The room grew very quiet. The general counsel mentioned liability exposure, potential lawsuits, regulatory complications. Victoria acknowledged each concern, but did not waver. She said there were risks in taking action, but greater risks in remaining silent. Every day those aircraft flew without proper inspection was a day they were gambling with passenger lives. Every year Ethan Cole spent in professional exile was a year the company compounded its original injustice. Her chief operating officer suggested forming a committee to study options. Victoria shook her head firmly. She said committees had buried this problem once before. That delay was just another form of denial. She wanted the safety audit initiated within 72 hours. Wanted Ethan Cole contacted through official channels within the week. If board members objected, she would make her case directly to shareholders across the city. Ethan pulled into the driveway of his small rented house. Lily had fallen asleep during the drive. He carried her inside and laid her gently on her bed, pulling a blanket over her small form. She murmured something unintelligible and curled onto her side. He stood watching her for a long moment. This child who had given his life meaning when everything else had fallen apart. In his pocket, Victoria's card pressed against his hip like a question waiting to be answered. He pulled it out and studied her handwriting. 7 years ago, he would have given anything for someone at Hale Aerospace to listen. Now that someone was offering exactly that, he was not sure what to do with it. The anger he had carried for so long was not gone, but it had changed shape, becoming something more like exhaustion. He walked to the kitchen and started coffee, the familiar ritual soothing his racing thoughts. Outside, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky orange and purple. He thought about the turbulence, about Captain Webb trusting a stranger's advice, about Victoria admitting her company had wronged him. He thought about Lily asking if the planes were safe. 3 weeks passed before Ethan called the number on the card. News had broken about Hale Aerospace initiating a voluntary safety review of its H-7 fleet. Industry analysts speculated about reasons Victoria had navigated press coverage with careful vagueness, not mentioning Ethan's name publicly, understanding any disclosure needed to come from him. When her phone rang with an unfamiliar number, she answered on the second ring. Ethan's voice was calm and measured. He said he had been thinking about her offer and had some questions. She said she would answer whatever she could. He asked if she was prepared to admit publicly that the company had been wrong, that they had silenced him to protect their production schedule. She said yes, if that was what he wanted. He asked what she expected from him in return. She said nothing, that this was not a transaction. They agreed to meet the following day at a coffee shop near the waterfront, where neither would be recognized. Ethan arrived first, choosing a table with a clear view of the entrance. When Victoria walked in, dressed in jeans and a simple sweater, she looked different from the woman on the plane. Less armored, more human. She ordered black coffee and sat across from him, waiting for him to speak first. He told her about the past 7 years, the jobs lost, the relationships crumbled under the weight of his bitterness. He told her about the dark period when he had considered giving up entirely, when only Lily's existence kept him from disappearing. He told her about the slow process of rebuilding, finding work that used his skills without consuming his soul, creating a stable home for his daughter. He told her that what had been taken could not be fully restored, that some wounds left scars even when they healed. Victoria listened without interrupting, her coffee growing cold. When he finished, she did not offer platitudes. She said she understood that she could not undo the past, but could try to shape a better future. She told him about safety review findings, modifications being implemented, training programs being developed. She told him about the internal investigation, executives being held accountable, culture changes she was implementing. She told him his original reports were being added to the official record, his conclusions validated. Ethan asked what she wanted from him now. Victoria said she wanted him to consider consulting for the company, bringing his expertise to new designs before they reached production. She wanted his voice in the room where decisions were made, a counterbalance to the pressures that had silenced him. She said she understood if he refused, if the wound was too deep. But the offer was genuine. He asked about the little girl on the plane who had asked about safety. Victoria looked confused momentarily, then smiled sadly and said Lily was his daughter, that she herself did not have children. Ethan nodded. He said Lily had asked afterward why the lady from the airplane seemed sad. Children noticed things. Adults tried to hide. Victoria admitted she had been sad, that meeting him had forced her to confront failures she had not known existed. They talked for another hour, conversation ranging from technical specifications to personal histories to philosophies of leadership. By the time they parted, something had shifted between them. Not friendship exactly, but the foundation of something that might become respect. Victoria did not press for an answer. She said he knew where to find her when ready. Ethan drove home through evening traffic, his mind processing everything. Lily was at a neighbor's house playing with their dog, and he had an hour of solitude. He sat in his parked car, staring at the house he had built his new life around, trying to imagine what that life might look like if he accepted Victoria's offer. It would mean engaging with the industry that had hurt him, trusting people who worked for the company that had betrayed him. It would mean risking disappointment again. But it would also mean using his knowledge to prevent others from suffering what he had suffered. It would mean being in the room when safety decisions were made, advocating for passengers who trusted that the aircraft carrying them had been properly designed. It would mean showing Lily that sometimes the bravest thing was not walking away from pain, but walking through it towards something better. He called Victoria that evening and accepted the position. She thanked him with genuine warmth and said contracts would be ready by end of week. He said he had one condition, that he wanted to maintain his current job at the regional airport alongside consulting. He needed to stay grounded, connected to the practical reality of aviation rather than getting lost in corporate abstractions. Victoria agreed without hesitation. In the months that followed, Ethan became a familiar presence in Hale Aerospace design meetings. His contributions were sometimes uncomfortable, challenging assumptions engineers had taken for granted. But Victoria supported him consistently, ensuring his voice was heard. The HA-9 production continued, incorporating his modifications. The H-7 fleet completed its safety review and affected aircraft were retrofitted. No incidents occurred, but the near misses stopped too. Lily turned 8 inches this spring, celebrating with a party at the regional airport where her father worked. She gave tours of the hangars to school friends, explaining with inherited precision how different aircraft systems functioned. She had lost her fear of flying entirely, replaced by a curiosity that reminded Ethan of himself at that age. When she asked if she could become a pilot someday, he told her she could become anything she wanted, that the sky was not a limit, but an invitation. Victoria attended the birthday party, bringing a gift wrapped in paper covered with cartoon airplanes. She had become a regular presence in their lives over the months. Not quite a friend, but something close. The complicated history between them had not been erased, but it had been acknowledged and processed and laid to rest. What remained was a working relationship, built on mutual respect and shared commitment to doing things right. As Ethan watched his daughter blow out her candles, surrounded by friends and laughter, he thought about the chain of events that had led to this moment. A last-minute booking, a seat at the back of the plane, a patch of turbulence that demanded response. The randomness of life had put him in exactly the right place at exactly the right time to be seen by exactly the right person. He did not believe in fate, but he believed in the choices that followed fortunate accidents. He had chosen to help when help was needed. Victoria had chosen to listen when listening was hard. They had both chosen to move forward rather than remain trapped by the past. The last guest left as the sun was setting, and Ethan began cleaning up scattered plates and deflated balloons. Lily helped for a few minutes before exhaustion claimed her, and he carried her to bed just as he had on the night they returned from Seattle. She was getting too big for him to carry easily, growing faster than he could quite believe. Soon, she would be too old for birthday parties with cartoon decorations, too old to need her father's hand during takeoff. But that was the nature of children and time. He stood at the window of her darkened room, watching the lights of an aircraft track across the sky. It was probably an HA-9, one of the planes that now carried his influence in its design. Every passenger on that flight was a little safer because he had refused to be silenced, because Victoria had chosen to listen, because they had found a way to transform old wrongs into new commitments. It was not the career he had imagined when he was young and full of ambition, but it was a career worth having, a contribution worth making. The aircraft disappeared into the clouds, its lights blinking steadily against the darkness. Tomorrow, there would be meetings and reports and the endless work of making complex systems safer. Tonight, there was only this: a father watching his daughter sleep, a quiet house in a quiet neighborhood, a life rebuilt from the wreckage of injustice. The seat at the back of the plane had been the last available, but it had also been exactly where he needed to.